Let us now talk about client-server communication using the Angular ng resource module and the resource service. The resource service is a higher level abstraction than the HTTP service, and the resource service facilitates communication with a server that exports a RESTful API. So we'll look at the details next. As I mentioned, the Angular ng resource module is the one that provides us access to the resource service. And this is a higher level abstraction for interacting with a RESTful API web server. This is not part of Angular core, so you have to explicitly install the ng resource module. How do we install the Angular resource module? Bower install angular-resource -s. And then once the resource module is installed, then you need to do dependency injection to include the ng resource into our Angular app module. The Angular resource service is a convenient wrapper around the REST API that a server supports, and the resource service provides us access to all the CRUD operations. To make use of the resource service, you need to inject that into any controller or service where you're going to make use of it. Now, in my example, I am going to use the resource service inside the services that I implemented, the menu factory and the other services that I implemented in services.js file. So I need to inject that. So as shown in that example, I'm injecting the resource service into the menu factory service. And that way we have access to the resource service. Now, when you call the resource service, you can supply a URL, which is the server that exports the API. Then you can supply some default parameters, actions, and some options. Let's look at some examples to understand how we make use of this. The resource service supports some default actions. The default actions are get, save, query, remove, and delete. Get and save, as you can see, perform the get and the post operations. The query does the get operation but gets you an array of JSON objects from the server. The remove and delete are equivalent to each other, and then they allow you to perform the delete operation. Let's look at some examples of using resources. So you would declare a resource as $resource, and then you supply the URL and then some methods. If you're going to declare your own custom methods, we'll look at them in a bit more detail. The built-in methods that come with resource are query, get, save, remove, and delete. How do we make use of a resource? Let's look at the first example here. I say scope dishes equal to resource, and I specify the entire resource, and then dot query. Now this is going to return a JSON object array for me. Now, before it returns, when I say scope.dishes equal to that, before the data is obtained from the server, scope.dishes will be equated to an empty object array by default. Once the data comes in, then scope.dishes will be initialized with the incoming data. So you already have access to an object, an empty object, even before the data comes in. So that's why we don't need to explicitly initialize scope.dishes to an empty object in our code anymore. Now, if you need to perform other operations, say for example in the second method I do a get operation, so I can specify get id equal to 0, and then inside there I can specify a function, and in there I can use a dollar prefix with any of the methods that I talked about, because the resource, a call to the resource, will return an object of the resource class, and all the methods the save, delete, and remove methods, all the non-get methods are available to you automatically, and then you can invoke them on individual objects by saying, say for example, dish $save, meaning that save the changes to this object. You can also create custom put requests. When you looked at the built-in methods for resource, you didn't see me specifying a put resource there. The put doesn't exist explicitly in the resource, but you can create your own custom method which you can designate to use the put operation. So in this case, I declared an update method, and for this update method I specify the method to interact with the server as put. So if I call resources dot update, it is going to use the put method to perform the operation on the server. So the update could be a method that I can make use of to send a update to an existing object to the server. Indeed, in the example later, we will see the use of the update method for updating an object on the server. Some of the resource methods take both success and error functions as parameters. As you see in this example that I show, the query method is taking both a success function and an error function. So in this case, if the request doesn't succeed, then the error function will be called. If the request succeeds, then the success function is going to be called. Now, one important thing to note, distinction to be noted here, is that when the success function is called, the parameter coming, the response, is actually the actual body of the message coming in. Whereas if it is the error, the response contains the entire response message. So you get access to the status code, and so on by using response.status and response.status code in this case. You can also use a promise method that is exported by the resource. So for example, you can say resource.get, and then you can use $promise and then have access to the promise that this resource sends. In that case, then you can use the then method on that promise and then implement the success and error functions inside the then method. So that's another use of the promise, $promise on the resource. Now that we have learned something about resources, we're going to make use of resources within our application. Now, we had used the HTTP methods, HTTP service and the methods in the previous exercise. Now, we're going to update that same exercise to use the resource methods. So the next two exercises deal with using the resource service and also handling errors that might arise when you use the resource service.